The stars had never seemed so close before Jake Morrison took command of the UES Horizon. The year was 2387 and humanity had finally cracked the secret of faster-than-light travel. The quantum fold drive hummed beneath his feet as he stood on the bridge watching the endless black of space. His crew of 200 brave souls had volunteered for this mission, knowing they might never return home. Amy Collins looked up from her science station and smiled at the captain. She was young for a xenobiologist, but her mind was sharp and her enthusiasm infectious. The rest of the crew trusted her judgment completely. Jake had handpicked every person on this ship, and Amy was one of his best choices. The Horizon had been traveling for 3 months toward Proxima Centauri when their sensors detected something impossible. A massive structure hung in the void between stars like a metal city floating in darkness. It was easily 50 times larger than their own ship, and covered in strange markings that pulsed with blue light. Jake ordered his communications officer to send a standard first contact message. The response came within minutes, and it was not what anyone expected. The alien voice that spoke through their speakers was deep and filled with what sounded like amusement. The massive alien ship pulled the Horizon into a docking bay using some kind of invisible force beam. Jake had no choice but to allow it to happen. Fighting would have been suicide against such overwhelming technology. His crew prepared for the unknown as the ships connected with a soft thud. The beings that greeted them were nothing like the small gray aliens from old Earth movies. These creatures stood 8 feet tall with thick natural armor covering their bodies. Their faces were angular and sharp with glowing red eyes that seemed to look right through human skin, to judge what lay beneath. They moved with the confidence of apex predators who had never known fear. The leader introduced himself as High Commander Vex Korath of the Zeltharian Empire. His voice carried the weight of someone used to absolute obedience. When he spoke, other Zeltharians stood straighter and listened with complete attention. Jake tried to maintain his diplomatic composure but felt like a child standing before giants. Korath looked down at the human delegation and his mouth twisted into what might have been a smile on a less frightening face. He gestured for them to follow him through corridors that seemed designed for beings much larger than humans. The walls were covered in metal that shifted colors as they walked past, and the ceiling was high enough to make Jake feel insignificant. They entered a vast chamber where dozens of Zeltharian officers stood at attention. Each one was armed with weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. Their armor gleamed under lights that had no visible source, and their eyes never stopped moving as they evaluated the human visitors. Korath took his place on a raised platform and began to speak. His words were translated by devices the humans could not see, but his tone needed no translation. He was not impressed by what he saw. The High Commander explained that the Zeltharian Empire had ruled this section of the galaxy for over 10,000 years. They had conquered hundreds of worlds and enslaved dozens of species. Their technology was so advanced that they could destroy entire planets with a single weapon. Their warriors were bred for battle and had never known defeat. Jake listened with growing dread as Korath described the Empire's power. The alien leader spoke of wars that lasted centuries, and enemies who were crushed beneath Zeltharian might. He talked about species that had tried to resist and were now nothing but dust floating in space. Then Korath looked directly at Jake and began to laugh. It was not a pleasant sound, but rather something that made the humans step back in fear. Other Zeltharians joined in until the chamber echoed with alien amusement. Korath asked how creatures so small and weak could claim to represent an entire civilization. He pointed out that humans had soft skin that could be cut by the simplest blade. Their bones would break under pressure that Zeltharians barely noticed. Their lifespans were shorter than some Zeltharian training programs. The alien commander walked closer to examine the humans like specimens in a laboratory. He noted their primitive clothing and basic equipment with obvious disgust. Their technology was centuries behind Zeltharian science, and their weapons were little more than toys. Even their ship was a pathetic example of space travel that would have been scrapped by the Empire millennia ago. Amy Collins tried to speak up about human achievements, but Korath cut her off with a gesture. He explained that the Empire had seen thousands of species like humanity. All of them had thought they were special until Zeltharian reality crushed their dreams. None had survived long enough to matter. The High Commander then made his offer. Humanity could become a protected species under Empire rule. They would mine resources and provide labor for their betters. In return, the Zeltharians would allow humans to continue existing under proper supervision. It was more than most conquered species received. Jake asked what would happen if humanity refused this generous offer. Korath smiled again, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. He explained that refusal would mean total war against an enemy humanity could not possibly defeat. The Empire would glass Earth and scatter human atoms across space as a warning to other foolish species. The Zeltharian leader gave humanity 6 months to make their decision. He considered this extremely generous given how obvious the choice should be. Any rational species would immediately accept protection rather than face certain destruction. Jake and his crew were escorted back to their ship in silence. The Zeltharians watched them go with expressions of bored superiority. These humans were just another weak species that would soon learn their proper place in the galactic order. The horizon pulled away from the alien vessel. Amy Collins began analyzing everything they had seen and heard. Her scientific mind was already working on the problem, but the odds seemed impossible. How could humanity possibly stand against an empire that commanded such overwhelming power? Jake set course for Earth, knowing that he carried news that would change everything. The journey home felt longer than the trip out as every crew member contemplated what awaited their species. They had gone looking for new worlds and instead found masters who saw them as nothing more than useful animals. The blue marble of Earth appeared on their screens after weeks of travel, and Jake had never been so happy to see home. But he also knew that this might be one of the last times he would see it free. In 6 months, everything would change and humanity would learn whether they had the strength to remain masters of their own destiny. The news that Jake Morrison brought back to Earth sent shockwaves through every government and military organization on the planet. The United Earth Council convened emergency sessions that lasted for days as leaders tried to process the reality of their situation. Humanity was no longer alone in the universe, and their new neighbors saw them as primitive creatures barely worthy of slavery. General Nathan Cross stood before the assembled council members, with Jake Morrison at his side. The captain had told his story dozens of times, but it never got easier to hear. Cross was a career military man who had fought in the resource wars of the 2340s, and he understood what it meant to face overwhelming odds. But nothing in his experience compared to the threat the Zeltharian Empire represented. The council chamber erupted in heated debate as representatives argued over how to respond. Some demanded immediate surrender to save human lives, while others called for resistance despite the hopeless odds. The arguments went on for hours with no clear consensus emerging from the chaos of voices. Dr. Helen Grant sat quietly in the back of the chamber, taking notes and analyzing everything she had heard about Zeltharian technology. As Earth's leading physicist, she understood better than most how advanced their enemies truly were. But her scientific mind also noticed details that others might have missed. 3 weeks after the Horizon returned home, Zeltharian scout ships appeared at the edge of the solar system. There were only 5 vessels, but each one was larger than anything humanity had ever built. They moved through space with casual arrogance, broadcasting messages demanding immediate attention from Earth's leaders. Commander Lyra Voss led the assessment team with orders to catalog human resources and military capabilities. She was a veteran officer who had participated in dozens of conquests, and she approached this assignment with professional boredom. Another primitive species would soon learn their place in the galactic order. The Zeltharian ships took positions throughout the solar system and began systematic scans of every human installation. They examined Earth's orbital stations with instruments that could detect the smallest details from millions of miles away. Their technology made human attempts at concealment laughably ineffective. Voss reviewed the preliminary reports with growing amusement. Human weapons were based on chemical explosives and metal projectiles that would barely scratch Zeltharian armor. Their fastest ships used crude rocket technology that the Empire had abandoned thousands of years ago. Even their most advanced computers were primitive by galactic standards. The assessment team discovered that humans still practiced something called agriculture to produce food instead of simply synthesizing whatever nutrients they needed. They lived in separate family units and formed emotional attachments to individuals who shared no genetic connection with them. Such behavior was considered a sign of evolutionary weakness by Zeltharian standards. General Cross watched the alien ships through powerful telescopes and felt his anger growing with each passing day. The Zeltharians made no attempt to hide their contempt for humanity. Their communications were filled with barely Concealed mockery in their behavior suggested they saw humans as little more than interesting animals. Amy Collins had been promoted to head xenobiologist for Earth Defense, and she spent every waking hour studying the limited data available about their enemies. The Zeltharians were physically superior to humans in every measurable way, but Amy noticed something strange in their behavior patterns. They seemed to fight as individuals rather than coordinated units. Jake Morrison found himself caught between his military duties and his growing dread about humanity's future. He had seen Zeltharian technology firsthand and knew that conventional resistance would be suicide, but he also understood that surrender meant the end of human freedom and possibly human existence as a separate species. The aliens decided to demonstrate their power by destroying one of Jupiter's smaller moons with a weapon that turned solid matter into expanding plasma in seconds. They broadcast the destruction across every communication network on Earth to ensure that no human missed the message. The display was meant to end all thoughts of resistance. Instead of immediate surrender, the destruction seemed to galvanize human determination. Dr. Grant studied the energy patterns from the weapon and made notes about the quantum signatures involved. The Zeltharian technology was incredibly advanced, but it followed predictable physical laws that human science could understand. Commander Voss reported back to High Command that humanity showed signs of stubborn irrationality. Instead of accepting the obvious reality of their situation, humans continued to hold meetings and make preparations for what appeared to be military resistance. Such behavior was illogical but not unprecedented among primitive species. The assessment team began detailed scans of Earth's surface looking for hidden military installations and advanced technology. They found extensive tunnel networks and underground facilities, but nothing that posed any real threat to Zeltharian forces. Human defenses were pathetic by galactic standards. General Cross implemented emergency protocols that had been developed for global warfare scenarios. Every available resource was redirected toward military production, and millions of civilians were evacuated from major population centers. The preparations were impressive by human standards but meaningless against enemies who commanded planet-killing weapons. Dr. Grant made a breakthrough when she realized that Zeltharian confidence might be their greatest weakness. The Empire had not fought a real war in over 1,000 years, and their tactics reflected that comfortable superiority. They had grown careless because no enemy had ever forced them to adapt. Jake Morrison launched secret reconnaissance missions using small ships that the Zeltharians dismissed as insignificant. The aliens were so confident in their superiority that they paid no attention to vessels they considered harmless. This oversight allowed human intelligence-gathering operations to continue undetected. The data collected by these missions revealed important details about Zeltharian military organization and technology. Their ships were incredibly powerful but also incredibly complex with systems that required constant maintenance. Their warriors were individually superior, but seemed to lack experience working together as coordinated units. Amy Collins began developing psychological profiles of their enemies based on observed behavior patterns. The Zeltharians appeared to value individual achievement over group success, and their society was built around personal dominance rather than cooperation. This cultural bias might create exploitable weaknesses in combat situations. As the 6-month deadline approached, human preparations intensified despite the hopeless odds. Underground factories produced weapons and equipment around the clock, while scientists worked to develop new technologies that might give humanity some small advantage. The entire species was mobilizing for a war they could not win. Commander Voss completed her final assessment report with professional satisfaction. Humanity possessed no weapons or technology that could threaten the Empire, and their military organization was primitive and predictable. The conquest would be completed quickly with minimal Zeltharian casualties, but hidden in the depths of human installation, scientists and engineers were working on projects that the aliens had never considered. Dr. Grant's team was weaponizing human creativity and adaptability in ways that Zeltharian logic could not predict. The assessment had been thorough, but it had missed humanity's greatest strength. The countdown to Decision Day continued, with both sides preparing for what seemed like an inevitable outcome. The Zeltharians expected easy victory while humans prepared for desperate resistance. Neither side fully understood what the other was truly capable of achieving when pushed to their absolute limits. The day of reckoning arrived with Earth's leaders delivering humanity's answer to the Zeltharian ultimatum. General Nathan Cross stood before the alien communication array and spoke words that would echo through galactic history. Humanity rejected the Empire's protection and chose to stand as a free species, regardless of the consequences. High Commander Korath received the message aboard his flagship as the full Zeltharian war fleet assembled at the edge of the solar system. 5,000 vessels of varying sizes created a wall of metal and energy weapons pointed directly at Earth. The sight should have terrified any rational enemy into immediate surrender. But humanity had spent 6 months preparing for this moment, and their response was unlike anything the Zeltharians had encountered before. Instead of massing their forces for a traditional battle, Earth's defenders scattered into thousands of small groups using tactics that seemed to make no logical sense. Engineer Pete Williams had spent months developing what humans called the neural network protocol. Every human fighter pilot and ship commander was connected through quantum communication links that allowed instant coordination across vast distances. While Zeltharians fought as individual warriors seeking personal glory, humans moved like a single organism with thousands of eyes and hands. Captain Lisa Park commanded a squadron of 50 small fighters that had been dismissed by Zeltharian intelligence as completely harmless. Her ships were tiny compared to alien vessels and armed with weapons that seemed pathetically weak, but Park and her pilots had trained for months to use these supposed disadvantages as strengths. When the Zeltharian fleet entered the inner solar system, they expected to face massed human forces in predictable defensive formations. Instead, they found empty space with no visible enemies anywhere on their sensors. The alien commanders were confused but not concerned, since their overwhelming firepower advantage remained unchanged. The first attack came from directions the Zeltharians had never considered. Hundreds of small human ships emerged from hiding places throughout the asteroid belt, moving in perfect coordination despite being spread across millions of miles. They struck like angry insects swarming around giants, who were too large to swat them. Effectively, Park's squadron focused their fire on a single Zeltharian cruiser while similar groups attacked other isolated targets. The alien ships were incredibly tough, but their massive size made them slow to respond to fast-moving threats. Human fighters darted between weapon systems too quickly for the larger guns to track. Dr. Helen Grant watched the battle unfold from her laboratory deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. Her team had spent months analyzing Zeltharian technology and developing counters for their most dangerous weapons. The aliens relied on energy shields that could stop any conventional attack, but Grant had found their weakness. The breakthrough came when Grant realized that Zeltharian shields were designed to stop energy weapons and large projectiles. They had never encountered an enemy primitive enough to use nuclear fission as a weapon system. While the Empire had moved beyond such crude technology millennia ago, humans had weaponized their primitiveness. A carefully placed nuclear device detonated inside the shield perimeter of the Zeltharian flagship, disrupting the quantum field that maintained the protective barrier. The explosion was small by space warfare standards, but it created a cascade failure that left the massive ship vulnerable to follow-up attacks. Commander Korath felt his ship shudder as systems failed throughout the vessel. His tactical officers reported shield failures and communication disruptions, but they could not explain how such primitive weapons had penetrated their defenses. The impossibility of the situation made the High Commander furious with rage. The battle revealed another aspect of human nature that the Zeltharians had completely misunderstood. When alien boarding parties tried to capture human ships, they expected to face cowering primitives who would surrender immediately. Instead, they met Major Sam Rodriguez and her specially trained Marines. Rodriguez had studied every piece of available data about Zeltharian anatomy and combat methods. Her soldiers wore powered armor designed specifically to counter alien advantages, and they fought with coordinated tactics that turned the enemy's individual superiority into a liability. The cramped corridors of human ships became death traps for warriors used to open combat. The Zeltharian boarding parties found themselves facing enemies who seemed to know exactly where they would attack next. Human defenders used their own ship layouts against invaders who had no experience fighting in such confined spaces. Every corridor became a carefully planned ambush zone. Amy Collins coordinated the biological warfare aspects of the human defense from her command center aboard the orbital station New Geneva. Her team had developed non-lethal agents that exploited weaknesses in Zeltharian physiology while having no effect on humans. The aliens found themselves fighting enemies who could poison the very air they breathed. As the battle raged across the solar system, human forces revealed layer after layer of unexpected capabilities. Their communications networks were more resilient than Zeltharian systems because they were designed to function independently rather than relying on centralized control. When alien forces cut one link, dozens of others maintained the connection. Jake Morrison led a group of converted cargo ships that had been disguised to look like helpless civilian vessels. When Zeltharian forces moved to capture what they thought were easy targets, they found themselves facing heavily armed warships that opened fire at point-blank range. The deception worked because the aliens had not considered that humans might deliberately appear weaker than they actually were. The tide of battle began to turn as human adaptability met Zeltharian rigidity in direct conflict. The Empire's forces were individually superior, but they had no experience dealing with enemies who refused to fight according to established patterns. Every time the aliens adapted to one human tactic, Earth's defenders shifted to something completely different. Dr. Grant's team released their masterstroke when they activated a network of hidden transmitters throughout the solar system. The devices broadcast electromagnetic interference patterns that disrupted Zeltharian quantum computers while having no effect on human systems. Suddenly, the technological advantage that the Empire relied on began working against them. High Commander Korath watched his fleet's coordination collapse as ship after ship lost communication with Central Command. His advanced targeting systems failed and his energy weapons began firing at random intervals. The humans were using the Empire's own technological sophistication as a weapon against them. The battle that was supposed to last hours stretched into days as human resistance proved far more effective than any Zeltharian analysis had predicted. Enemy forces that should have been swept aside in minutes instead inflicted serious damage on ships that had been considered invincible. Commander Lyra Voss found herself trapped aboard a damaged cruiser with half her crew dead or injured. The assessment that had dismissed human capabilities as negligible was proving catastrophically wrong. These primitives were fighting with intelligence and creativity that her people had forgotten how to counter as news of the unexpected human resistance spread. Throughout Zeltharian forces, doubt began to creep into minds that had never known uncertainty. If these weak creatures could inflict such damage, what did that say about the Empire's supposed invincibility? For the first time in 1,000 years, Zeltharian warriors began to question whether victory was guaranteed. The solar system became a graveyard of disabled alien vessels as human forces continued their relentless harassment campaign. Every Zeltharian advantage was being systematically neutralized by enemies who refused to accept that they were supposed to lose. The unthinkable was happening as the Empire's finest forces found themselves fighting for their lives against primitives they had dismissed as harmless. News of humanity's impossible victory against the Zeltharian fleet spread across the galaxy faster than anyone could have imagined. Species that had served the Empire for thousands of years suddenly began to whisper about the small creatures from a primitive world who had defeated forces that were supposed to be invincible. High Commander Korath barely escaped the solar system with less than half his original fleet intact. His flagship limped through hyperspace while emergency repair teams worked around the clock to keep critical systems functioning. The proud warrior, who had expected an easy conquest, now faced the greatest humiliation in Zeltharian military history. The Empire's response was swift and brutal. Grand Marshal Thex Varric assembled the largest military force in galactic history, with orders to make an example of humanity that would restore fear and respect for Zeltharian power. Over 10,000 warships of every class gathered in the staging area while the Empire's finest warriors prepared for total war. Admiral Kate Sullivan had been promoted to lead Earth's defense forces after General Cross was injured in the first battle. She was younger than most expected for such a crucial position, but her tactical brilliance had been proven in the recent victory. Sullivan understood that humanity's survival depended on fighting the next war completely differently than the last one. The months following the first Zeltharian defeat saw frantic preparation on both sides as each force prepared for what everyone knew would be the final confrontation. The Empire could not afford another loss, while humanity could not survive a defeat against such overwhelming numbers. Tony Chen had been a computer programmer before the war. but now he led the most important cyber warfare division in human history. His team had spent months infiltrating Zeltharian communication networks using techniques that the aliens had never encountered before. Their quantum computers were more powerful, but human systems were more adaptable and harder to detect. The infiltration began with simple monitoring of enemy communications, but gradually expanded into active sabotage operations. Human hackers learned to speak the electronic language of Zeltharian technology and began introducing subtle errors into navigation and targeting systems. Dr. Helen Grant worked with teams of scientists from every human colony to develop new weapons and tactics for the coming battle. They had learned valuable lessons from studying captured Zeltharian equipment, and their understanding of alien weaknesses continued to grow with each passing day. The breakthrough came when Grant's team realized that the Empire's greatest strength was also its most vulnerable weakness. Zeltharian technology was incredibly sophisticated, but it was also incredibly interconnected. Every ship and weapon system relied on constant communication with central command networks to function at peak efficiency. Meanwhile, resistance movements on dozens of worlds began coordinating their activities through hidden communication networks established by human intelligence operatives. Species that had never considered rebellion suddenly found themselves with the tools and knowledge needed to strike back at their oppressors. The aquatic Delphians had been enslaved for over 2,000 years, but their underwater cities had always been difficult for Zeltharian forces to control completely. When human agents made contact, they discovered a sophisticated resistance network that had been waiting for the right moment to act. The energy-based Luminari had been forced to provide power for Zeltharian installations throughout their home system. Their unique physiology made them perfectly suited for sabotage operations that other species could never attempt. When they joined the growing rebellion, their contributions proved invaluable. The diminutive Tectons were barely 4 feet tall, but their technical expertise rivaled even human engineers in some areas. They had been maintaining Zeltharian equipment for centuries, while secretly documenting weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Their knowledge became crucial to the resistance effort. Admiral Sullivan developed a strategy that played to every human strength while exploiting every Zeltharian weakness. Instead of defending Earth directly, she scattered human forces throughout dozens of star systems, where they could coordinate with local resistance movements. The plan required perfect timing and coordination across interstellar distances. Human ships would strike Zeltharian supply lines and communication networks while Allied forces launched simultaneous uprisings on key worlds. The Empire's vast size would become a liability as they struggled to respond to threats from every direction. Tony Chen's cyber warfare teams achieved their greatest success when they gained access to the central navigation computers used by the Zeltharian fleet. The aliens never suspected that their own systems were feeding them false information about jump coordinates and enemy positions. As Grand Marshal Varrock's massive fleet prepared to depart for Earth, they had no idea that their navigation systems had been compromised. The coordinates in their computers would take them to predetermined ambush points, where human forces waited in carefully prepared positions. The day of the final battle began with the largest hyperspace jump in galactic history, as 10,000 Zeltharian warships attempted to reach the solar system simultaneously. But instead of arriving at Earth, they emerged from hyperspace in scattered groups throughout human-controlled space. Admiral Sullivan watched from her command ship as the enemy fleet materialized exactly where her intelligence predicted they would appear. The Zeltharians found themselves separated into smaller groups facing coordinated attacks from human forces and their alien allies. The battle raged across dozens of star systems as the war that had begun around Earth expanded into a galaxy-wide rebellion against Zeltharian rule. Every species that had suffered under the Empire's oppression saw their chance for freedom and struck with centuries of accumulated rage. Captain Jake Morrison led a mixed fleet of human and alien vessels against a Zeltharian battle group near the Delphian homeworld. His ships moved in perfect coordination, despite being crewed by half a dozen different species who had never worked together before the rebellion began. The key to their success was humanity's ability to see potential in others, rather than focusing on differences and limitations. While the Empire ruled through fear and suppression, Humans united different species through mutual respect and shared purpose. Amy Collins served as a liaison between human forces and alien resistance groups, helping to coordinate tactics and strategy across species barriers. Her xenobiological expertise proved invaluable in developing combined operations that used each species' natural abilities to maximum advantage. The Delphians provided underwater tactical support that allowed rebel forces to attack Zeltharian installations from directions the Empire had never considered vulnerable. Their aquatic cities became hidden bases for operations throughout their star system. The Luminari shared their advanced shield technology with human engineers, who adapted it to work with Earth's weapon systems. The combination created defensive capabilities that exceeded what either species could achieve alone. The Tectons contributed miniaturization techniques that allowed human forces to hide massive amounts of equipment in spaces that Zeltharian sensors considered too small to contain anything dangerous. Their engineering skills turned asteroids and abandoned stations into hidden weapons platforms. Grand Marshal Varrock found his carefully planned conquest turning into a desperate struggle for survival, as his forces were attacked from every direction by enemies he had not known existed. The Empire's intelligence services had focused so completely on humanity that they missed the growing rebellion spreading throughout their territory. High Commander Korath rallied what remained of his original fleet for a final assault on Earth itself, but found his path blocked by a combined force of humans and aliens who had traveled across the galaxy to defend the world that had given them hope for freedom. The battle for Earth became a symbol of the larger struggle, as species that had been enemies for millennia stood together against the Empire that had oppressed them all. The Zeltharian dream of crushing human resistance had become a nightmare of galactic rebellion that threatened to tear their civilization apart. As the fighting continued, it became clear that something fundamental had changed in the balance of galactic power. The Empire that had seemed invincible was discovering that their subjects had been learning and growing stronger, while their masters had grown complacent and weak. The final assault on the Zeltharian homeworld began with the largest combined fleet in galactic history. Ships from dozens of species that had never worked together before moved in perfect coordination toward the heart of an empire that had ruled through fear for 10,000 years. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship as the rebel armada emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Zeltharian home system. The planet below was surrounded by massive orbital fortresses and defense platforms that had never been seriously threatened in living memory. The defenders were led by High Commander Korath, who had returned home in disgrace after his defeat at Earth. His reputation was ruined, but his tactical skills remained sharp, and he was determined to make the rebels pay dearly for their victory. The homeworld would not fall without a fight that would echo through history. Admiral Kate Sullivan coordinated the overall battle plan from her mobile command center, while smaller fleet commanders managed individual operations throughout the system. The strategy relied on the same principles that had brought them this far, with each species contributing their unique strengths to the common effort. The Delphian forces launched underwater assaults on the planet's ocean cities, while Luminari, energy beings, overloaded power grids and communication networks. Tecton engineers disabled orbital defense platforms from the inside, while human fighters provided cover for the larger operations. Dr. Helen Grant had developed the rebels' secret weapon during months of careful research and development. Her team had created a device that could harmonize the different technologies used by all the allied species, creating a new form of faster-than-light communication that made traditional military hierarchies obsolete. The device allowed instant coordination between forces spread across the entire star system, while also disrupting Zeltharian command and control networks. For the first time in their history, the Empire's forces found themselves fighting blind. While their enemies shared perfect information in real time, Tony Chen led cyber warfare operations that turned the Empire's advanced technology against itself, as human hackers gained control of critical defense systems. Automated weapons began firing on friendly targets while navigation computers guided Zeltharian reinforcements into carefully prepared ambush zones. The battle raged for days as both sides committed everything they had to the final confrontation. Orbital fortresses that had stood for millennia crumbled under concentrated fire, while ancient defense fleets found themselves outmaneuvered by enemies they had dismissed as primitives. Commander Amy Collins served as the primary liaison between human forces and the dozens of alien species fighting alongside them. Her diplomatic skills were crucial in maintaining unity among groups that had historical grievances dating back thousands of years. The turning point came when rebel forces penetrated the main orbital fortress protecting the Zeltharian capital city. High Commander Korath made his final stand in the fortress control center, surrounded by his most loyal warriors as enemy forces closed in from all directions. General Nathan Cross had recovered from his injuries and insisted on leading the assault team that would face Korath in the final confrontation. The two warriors met in single combat, not because humans valued individual glory, but because sometimes one person must step forward to represent the strength of all. The duel was brief and decisive as Cross used tactics developed specifically to counter Zeltharian advantages. The alien commander's superior strength and natural armor meant nothing against an opponent who had studied every weakness in his fighting style. With their leader dead and their defenses shattered, the remaining Zeltharian forces began to surrender, as the reality of defeat finally penetrated their proud minds. The empire that had seemed eternal was collapsing, as worlds throughout the galaxy declared their independence. But the rebels' greatest challenge came after the victory, as they faced the question of what would replace the fallen empire. Many species called for revenge against their former oppressors, while others demanded their own dominance over former Zeltharian territory. Admiral Morrison addressed the combined leadership of all rebel forces in a speech that would be remembered as one of the most important moments in galactic history. He argued that replacing one empire with another would only continue the cycle of oppression that had brought such suffering to so many worlds. Instead, he proposed the creation of something unprecedented in galactic politics. The Galactic Cooperative would be an alliance of equals, where each species maintained their independence while contributing to the common defense and prosperity of all members. The proposal faced significant opposition from species that wanted their own empires or who harbored ancient grudges against their neighbors. But humanity's moral authority, as the species that had sparked the rebellion, gave Morrison's words special weight in the negotiations. Dr. Grant's communication technology became the foundation for the new government, as it allowed truly democratic decision-making across interstellar distances. Representatives from thousands of worlds could participate in debates and votes without the delays and distortions that had made galactic democracy impossible before. The cooperative's first major decision was how to treat the defeated Zeltharians. Many rebels wanted harsh punishment for centuries of oppression, but the humans argued for a different approach. They offered former Empire citizens the chance to join the cooperative as equals if they renounced their imperial past. Commander Lyra Voss was among the first Zeltharians to accept the offer, despite fierce opposition from traditionalist elements of her own people. She had witnessed human courage firsthand and understood that cooperation offered far greater rewards than the domination her species had practiced for so long. The transformation was not easy as former enemies learned to work together and species that had been isolated for millennia opened their borders to neighbors they barely understood. But the alternative was a return to the cycle of conquest and oppression that had defined galactic politics for thousands of years. Years passed as the cooperative slowly took shape with humanity, playing a crucial role as mediators and peacekeepers. Their unique ability to see potential in others rather than focusing on differences and limitations made them natural leaders in the new order. Captain Jake Morrison eventually retired from active service and took a position training the next generation of space explorers at the new Galactic Academy. Students from dozens of species learned together in classrooms where former enemies worked side by side toward common goals. One day, a young human cadet asked Morrison what humanity's greatest strength had been during the war against the Empire. The old admiral smiled and considered the question carefully before giving his answer. Humanity had never learned how to give up, he explained. When the universe told them they were weak, they decided to prove it wrong. When faced with impossible odds, they found ways to turn their disadvantages into strengths. Most importantly, they understood that true power came not from domination, but from the courage to stand together with others against those who would oppress the weak. The galaxy had once been ruled by fear, but now it was learning to flourish under the radical concept that might did not always make right. Sometimes the small and seemingly weak possess the greatest strength of all when they refuse to accept defeat. The Zeltharians slowly adapted to their new role as equals rather than conquerors, with many discovering that cooperation yielded far greater rewards than domination ever could. Their warrior culture evolved to focus on protecting the innocent, rather than conquering the weak. The future remained uncertain as it always did, but the galaxy faced it together as allies rather than enemies. Humanity had kept their promise to prove the universe wrong about weakness, and in doing so had given countless species the gift of hope for a better tomorrow.